Hi, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Sonam Jindal, and before we get started and introduce our lovely speakers and discussants, I wanted to provide a brief overview of PAI's work in this area just to set the stage for our conversation today. High quality AI models require massive amounts of training data, but this data is often not legible to algorithmic systems. To make that data usable to train AI models, the industry relies on a large shadow workforce to label, structure, and enrich data. Over the last few years, there's been more research and coverage on the conditions facing data enrichment workers. However, these workers continue to face precarious conditions. At PAI, we wanted to change this. So we brought together a multi-stakeholder group of experts from across AI companies, vendors, and platforms that provide data labeling services, academics, and civil society for a series of workshops to discuss challenges and opportunities and contribute to a white paper that had targeted recommendations for how AI practitioners can start incorporating worker-oriented data enrichment practices into their workflows. So last year, we published this white paper, which highlighted what we wanted the industry to aim for. As a continuation of that paper and as the next phase of that work, we wanted to figure out how we could drive greater adoption of the white paper's recommendations. How could we change practice? And so we were looking to partner with an organization, an AI organization that would be willing to adopt those recommendations so we could develop an applied understanding of what it took to act on the recommendations. And our intention was to create an evidence base of feasibility for those recommendations and also prove that there was value in adopting those recommendations so we could more effectively advocate for widespread adoption across the industry. So we distilled the white paper into a set of 5 guidelines, which we will put a link to in the chat. And these guidelines are based on the white paper we published last year and were informed by the existing research and the multi-stakeholder workshops that we did in 2020. And over the last year, I'm really excited to share that we've been working with DeepMind to put them into practice. We're sharing what we learned over the course of this collaboration in a case study, which we'll also link to in the chat, along with a set of resources that we co-developed in partnership with DeepMind with the goal of lowering the barriers for other AI organizations to similarly commit to responsible data enrichment practices. We'll drop a link to all of those resources in the chat, and we won't go into too much depth right now into the details of those, but it'll come out in the discussion. And so with that, I'm really excited to introduce 2 amazing people from DeepMind to share their reflections from this collaboration. So just briefly, I'll share a little bit about each of them. Will Hawkins, one of our first speakers, leads the operational ethics and safety team at DeepMind and partners with research and engineering teams to analyze and assess the downstream implications of AI technologies. And Antonia is a science manager for the responsible development and innovation team at DeepMind, where she also partners with teams to evaluate opportunities and the real world impact of applying AI to scientific discovery. And so with that, welcome, Will and Antonia.
Hey, thank you so much for having us.
Thanks for being here. So really briefly, I wanted to start off by just asking, why was formalizing responsible data enrichment practices organization-wide across DeepMind a priority for the company and also for both of you? How this came up and why you're interested in it?
Yeah, maybe I can start with how it came up in the organization, and then we can go into our personal interest in this domain. So I think, Sonam, you've already outlined wonderfully the field at large is massively engaging more in human data collection of some kind via participation in behavioral research or via annotation tasks. And we've seen this over the course of the last decade, starting with models like or work like ImageNet, where MTurk workers, mechanical Turk workers, were asked to label thousands of images. And nowadays we see this still with things like labeling, but we also see this with things like reinforcement learning with human feedback, where the nature of tasks that humans are being asked to participate in are changing, but there are still real ethical questions to be answered when we're engaging in this type of work. Now, DeepMind is a primarily research organization. And so a lot of where we came from with this was from a research perspective. We were very familiar with processes like institutional review boards or research ethics committees, and actually began with our own IRB or REC a few years ago. And that's how we ran into the challenges that we've seen in data enrichment work, where our research ethics committee found difficulties looking at studies which involved data enrichment because they didn't involve voluntary participants. And we can talk more about that a little bit later. But having been engaged in the IRB, REC community and working out the challenges there, it really brought us to think about, well, what should this actually look like when we are engaging with workers in a setting that isn't traditional research, if they're conducting tasks like labeling. And that brought us to have many conversations with you over the last year. I would also add, and Antonio, please add as well, that personally this topic was the focus of my master's program and has been a personal interest for various years. So yeah, I've been really excited to work with PAI, and I'm excited to talk about it now.
Awesome. And I guess, like, I'm curious, it seems like there was already sort of some foundation there in terms of the review process, and you were already sort of thinking about these things organizationally. But I'm curious, did you have to convince anyone? And I guess, what did it take for you to convince the relevant internal stakeholders to build support for this initiative, to say, okay, no, we need to go a step further. We can't, this isn't cutting it. Just IRB is not covering these additional use cases that are emerging. Did you face any pushback? And if so, how did you sort of handle those conversations and convince them? And part of the reason I'm asking is because a few of our audience members are maybe at similar companies and hoping to do similar things. And so what can they learn from your experience doing this?
Yeah, I'm happy to say that one. So yeah, as you mentioned, like, we already had this kind of existing review system in place. So it wasn't a massive lift to build support for this initiative. I think it helped that this came from both the committee members of our existing review process, as Will mentioned, we're running into challenges there, and also from researchers who are kind of wanting more guidance. But when communicating our needs to the senior stakeholders, we made sure to highlight, like, not only would this provide researchers with clarification on the requirements they would need to meet for responsible data collection, but also that this would ensure higher quality data, and in turn would help provide, would ultimately increase the efficiency of the approval and launch processes, given that everyone was very much clearer on what they needed to do. And that's always an important selling point when integrating new governance systems, is really channeling how it's going to increase efficiency.
Yeah, that's fair. And I'm glad you mentioned governance systems, because I think like, this is sort of an interesting way to set it up within sort of a private company in terms of having a review process. And so I'm curious, can you describe the review process a little bit more, and how it functions, and why it's in place, and why this governance structure is important to getting everyone aligned, and also ensuring that there's some compliance to a standardized set of guidelines?
Yeah, sure. So as Will mentioned earlier, we had this existing kind of IRB style review process. So this was called our Human Behavioural Research Ethics Committee, or known as HUBREC. And that kind of started running in kind of mid-2019. And this began in response to a need for research papers that we were submitting to either journals or to conferences. They had a requirement to have a research ethics opinion, much like the kind of classic IRB style. And so this is what we spun up. And the committee itself is, as I said, modelled on a classic IRB, and has internal and external members with varying expertise across behavioural research, and is run by an independent chair. And as time went on, kind of the committee became more embedded into this wider human data collection process, meaning that HUBREC was then reviewing all types of human data collection. But as Will alluded to, the limitations of applying kind of research ethics to AI research became clearer, as these standards were always designed for protecting voluntary human participants, which is often not the case for data enrichment workers. And so with this in mind, we then held a kind of committee meeting, and then we decided that Hubrik should return to its original scope of strictly reviewing behavioural research studies, but that kind of all other studies should be assessed by this alternative internal process.
And I'm curious, you mentioned also like the research teams were looking for guidance and very interested in having that in place as well. And that might be counterintuitive to some. So what are some of the benefits of having something like this in place for both, you mentioned at the organization level why this was a priority, but also on the individual research team level, why are researchers excited about this? And like over the course of the interviews we had, it did seem like they were actively looking for more guidance and excited to engage with us as we were doing this. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, of course. So I would say DeepMind has a strong culture of safety and ethics. Like we have a set of operating principles, and that we kind of hold all of our research against. And I feel like because we already had that in place, a lot of researchers want to make sure that the way in which they're creating their data sets or creating their models is reflective of those kind of best practices more widely. But as we touched on earlier, kind of establishing a set of concrete best practices for the specific task of data enrichment or collecting data enrichment has really improved researchers' confidence in their study design and their execution. And so it's kind of given them the sense of autonomy that they feel they needed to be able to successfully design and deliver a data enrichment study. And this, again, as I mentioned earlier, has made the launch and the approval processes more efficient, and more importantly, has improved the experience of the data enrichment professionals involved. And as you mentioned, this has certainly definitely been reflected in the feedback that we've received from the teams. So guidance on anything from kind of piloting to payment terms has removed a lot of that kind of existing ambiguity in designing experiments, and has allowed them to also set kind of realistic timelines for the end-to-end data collection process, which has helped them enormously from anything from like headcount to budget allocation.
I think it's also worth emphasizing a point, Antonia, that you made a little bit earlier about the external landscape and the changing external pressures we've seen over the last few years. 4 or 5 years ago, AI conferences, and a lot of the outputs of DeepMind are research papers. AI conferences, AI journals were not paying attention to this issue, and that is changing now. Conferences such as NeurIPS, like the biggest venue for organizations like ourselves, now require people to disclose payment rates, to disclose IRB reviews or other types of research reviews. And the moment you have those types of incentive structures provided externally and on the outside, even the most skeptical or cynical people in AI organizations will need to start thinking very carefully about how they're approaching this. And when there are standards set across the industry, it helps create an incentive and a motive for people to care and really think carefully about this.
Yeah. And kind of like reflecting back a little bit, what sort of been, and you've kind of already answered this a little bit, but can you talk a little bit about some of the feedback that you've gotten from research teams, some of like the early surveys and interviews that we've had, just what they've been saying about this process?
Yeah, so I think the feedback has also been kind of coupled alongside the distribution of the guidelines as well. So having these best practices have been incredibly helpful for them on the kind of ideation and creation of their studies, but also whilst we were carrying out these kind of first round of feedback and interviews with researchers, it really clarified to us what kind of like communication channels we needed to create, how could we effectively communicate not just the best practices but all the processes involved, to researchers, and that I think has been incredibly helpful, and the feedback that we've had from that has been enormous. I think just having something that's digestible and clear, and also having someone like a direct point of contact in which to discuss any concerns you might have with whether or not your study might reach the best practices, for example, and why that might be the case, I think has been really helpful.
So we'll get into more questions for you guys soon as well, once we bring the whole group together. But I kind of want to move into a portion and see if, so we have two speakers here, also two discussants who are going to review what we've done and sort of offer some thoughts on how to go forward, and sort of share their reflections based off of their experience. So I'm really excited to introduce Jessica and Jonas to the conversation. Jessica will go first, but Jessica is an associate director at BSR, which is an organization composed of and focusing on sustainable business, and works with a global network of the world's leading companies to build a just and sustainable world. She also managed the Global Impact Sourcing Coalition, which was a global network of businesses that aim to create jobs for those most in need through the power of procurement and global supply chains. And she also worked at Fair Trade Certified, where she designed, implemented, and managed certification programs in agricultural supply chains and helped companies execute their responsible sourcing strategies. So I'm really excited to hear what Jessica has to say, and I'll introduce Jonas after Jessica. But Jessica, the floor is yours if you want to share your thoughts.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Sonam. I'd forgotten some of those things in the in the past. It's really a pleasure to be here and be a part of this discussion. Thank you for having me. And I just really want to congratulate the Partnership on AI and DeepMind for this work. While there are, of course, some limitations, which I think you really nicely spelled out in the case, and opportunities to further build on this case study, I really see this as a leap forward in this field. And I see that as a leap both from the perspective of elevating awareness of labor concerns in the AI supply chain, which unfortunately just still doesn't really often seem to be as central a part of the discourse or the agenda for ethical and responsible AI. And also, I think just a leap in terms of showing pathways to practical action. We put out a co-authored blog, BSR and Partnership on AI, a few months ago after doing a bit of shared research and exploration on the opportunities for collaborative action to advance responsible sourcing of data enrichment. And one of the key findings was really that individual company awareness of the issues and therefore also good practice are just still very nascent. And it's one of those areas where in our work, despite its relevance to human rights due diligence, responsible sourcing agendas, it's been difficult to gain traction and get adequate attention on among competing priorities, and even where there are clearly internal interests in engaging on it. So I really want to applaud Partnership on AI and this partnership, not just for continuing to shine the light here, but also for this very useful effort in partnership with DeepMind to show the pathway to practical action for companies, and also specifically for actors within companies that really have the power to shape and influence conditions for data enrichment workers, even while maybe the full system is still kind of in its nascency. And I think one important thing to call out here is that as issue awareness does grow, practical action and tools for implementation become really important to drive towards the goal of engaging and improving conditions versus just avoiding them. So while there are clear labor risks, digitally distributed work has created new economic opportunities, including for many who were previously excluded from traditional workforce opportunities, whether that's due to discrimination, caregiving responsibilities, geographic location, among other things. And what we really hope to see is companies not seeking to eliminate types of work from their supply chain, but rather to engage and partner with suppliers in the sector to ensure that labor rights are respected and that working conditions enable data enrichment professionals to really be in a space where they're thriving and advancing in the field that they're themselves helping to build. So the types of guidance and tools created as part of this case study, I think are just a really critical foundation for that. In terms of the case and resources itself, and just kind of as I was reflecting on building how we build on this work and continue pushing for improved conditions for workers, there were a few things that stuck out to me as I was reviewing. In one area, I think the detail shared on the review process and how to apply for an exception and what the non-negotiables are, this is very useful. I think while every company has to define their own management and governance processes, having an example of what works in a specific scenario can be a really instructive foundation. And I think many companies will appreciate the transparency here as a learning tool and potentially a template that can be put into place as well. I was hoping to see a little more detail on the predominant sourcing streams. Because that has implications, or I suspect it has implications for the instruction given, based on the different types of work arrangements in those sourcing streams. So at the outset of the case, you mentioned calling data enrichment workers to acknowledge that there are different forms of work. So if they're showing up as crowd workers through the platform, or if they're employees at a managed service providers, for example. The latter really has a wholly different set of protections and expectations than the former. So if there's any kind of helpful distinction to make there in the guidance, I think that could be really useful transparency. And then finally, I was really very interested in the commitment to living wage and the calculations and sheets, because I think it's obviously very important, and it's also very hard to calculate and execute. And the main thing I wanted to call out was actually around if there is potential, or the potential to set the task rate pricing based on the value that data enrichment work contributes to the project or the product, and then double checking to make sure that it works out to be a living wage or above. So rather than letting living wage be the ceiling, which I think can perpetuate a race to the pricing floor geographically, as we've certainly seen in outsourcing generally, and it can also kind of perpetuate the continued disregard of the value that data enrichment workers are bringing to and building in the field. So that's kind of one area I'd like to see further exploration and work. And I'm cognizant of the time, so I want to wrap with just a few thoughts on, in terms of building the case to drive broader adoption of responsible sourcing for data enrichment. There were a few things that came to mind. One is just, when's the next case study coming? I think additional case studies with organizations that are sufficiently different from DeepMind that can help to illuminate the challenges and opportunities, or perhaps be adapted with additional tools for implementation. Companies that maybe don't have the predisposition of DeepMind, or are not primarily research organizations, maybe don't necessarily have existing or mature review processes. Maybe they do other things. I mean, at BSR, we often talk about tech for non-tech, or that every company is a tech company now. So what would a case study look like that helps to illuminate the implications or considerations for a company, that maybe is further removed from sourcing data enrichment, but could influence through its purchasing or implementation of AI-powered products and services. So a couple of additional lenses or examples, so that a critical mass of companies out there sourcing data enrichment or influencing it could identify with one of them and use it as implementation guidance, or just a way to get started. That could be a really important way to grow the awareness that we know, since that's such a problem. Another question that's been on my mind for a while is, how can the digital platforms be levers themselves? So to the extent that a large volume of enriched data is being sourced via digital crowd work through these platforms, there's a potential for an adjustment at the platform level. So for example, a living wage requirement at the platform level to have a much more significant impact than an individual company can have. So that could be the difference between an individual living wage commitment impacting one worker one time for one task versus it being the minimum bar for all workers on the platform. Not to detract at all from the achievement that's been made here, but just to look at the next step. And then finally, I think in supply chain and responsible sourcing efforts, we often see they arrive at a place where companies can no longer make progress alone, and they need to progress alongside peers and other supply chain actors and stakeholders. It's my sense that fully addressing these labor risks at scale is going to require industry or sector collaboration. So what's really cool about this is that as more companies begin to test and implement data enrichment processes like the guidance laid out in this case study, we'll learn more about what individual companies are really well placed to address through the piloting and the individual action. as well as where collaboration is going to be necessary for that like meaningful kind of last mile impact. In the meantime, these sorts of case studies really help to establish the foundation for shared learning, and ultimately, hopefully, we'll scale up to that effective collaborative effort in the future. So that's one last thing I look forward to see building on this. Thank you so much for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you. Thank you for very thoughtful feedback and remarks. And I feel like we could spend a day just kind of going over this and figuring out next steps. So very excited. It gives us a good place to, kick off an additional set of initiatives. And I'm very, very excited to keep engaging on this and hopefully start talking about some of the questions, some of these big questions that you've raised. In the meantime, we'll get to sort of, I have a couple of follow-up questions for you, but before that, I wanted to give Jonas also a chance to share his remarks as well before we get into a full sort of Q&A. So I'll quickly introduce Jonas and then hand it over to him. So Jonas is a postdoctoral researcher at the Oxford Internet Institute and responsible for co-leading the CloudWork project inside Fair Work Foundation. Fair Work is committed to highlighting best and worst labor practices in the platform economy, and they recently published a new set of ratings for CloudWork platforms in, I think, 3-ish months ago. And their goal is to show that better and fairer jobs are possible in the platform economy. Jonas has been the author of books and articles on regulation of communication and information, communication policies, online platforms, and digital monopolies. Thank you so much, Jonas, for being here. And with that, I'll pass it on to you.
Hi, Sonam. Thank you so much. And hi to you and all my colleagues today. Thank you for the invitation and congratulations to PAI and DeepMind for fostering fair workers' conditions with initiatives like this case study. The changes implementation process seemed so well structured with internal feedback and testing initiatives. But the first question here, how does the company plan to add feedback from external stakeholders, especially workers and workers' organizations? The guidelines document captures crucial recommendations from the white paper. The white paper, though, goes beyond those topics and add other aspects which could positively impact workers. And how does the company plan to use a more detailed version of the points and suggestions listed in the document? About DeepMind's additional policies that are listed in the case study, it is a positive that the company acknowledged the need to avoid mass rejections. This is a major problem inside cloud work platforms, but it could also benefit workers to consider other forms of mitigating unpaid labor. Also, it's highly essential to recognize that payments must be in cash, but it can be productive to add other standards, such as to avoid contest systems and vendors with unreasonable payments timeframes. We've seen a lot of workers taking a lot of time to get money for the work that they have done. Concerning the adapted review process, the review process highlights no exceptions to paying the local living wage and the recourse mechanisms, and this is super important. So, but I bring another question here. Are there any other kinds of exceptions made to other guidelines related to workers' rights? Because I think that this is the place to draw the red line where we cannot make exceptions about basic labor standards. With regard to the good instructions checklist, the checklist highlight is very helpful for workers and reduces unnecessary mistakes that can lead to earning losses. But the blurry line pointed out by the document should be subject of more reflection, since those two conditions mix different right sets, labor rights and data protection rights. In relation to the vendor selection process, and this is a key point for me here, the PAI white paper lists as the first question to be considered when choosing a service provider what the commitments to labor standards, models of ethical sourcings, and social missions are in place. In line with that, I would like to stress that it's crucial to set minimum labor standards during this process, such as the ones that are listed on the PAI white paper or other frameworks. For instance, Fair Works framework, and the ILO's Decent Work Guidelines. The comparison table lists important criteria such as payment rates and payment structure or communication mechanisms. Although the goal of the case study is clearly linked to the PAI guidelines, it would be interesting for DeepMind to add other benchmarks and principles from independent research organizations. In addition to the PAI guidelines, DeepMind could consider vendors' rules and practices regarding, for example, compliance with national legal standards, oversupply of workforce and overwork mitigation, transparent and fair contracts, adequate data protection, due process, anti-discrimination policies, and free association and representation, including collective bargaining. And here is very crucial to talk about what Jessica just mentioned, how we can create an incentive system in the digital labor platforms, since these digital labor platforms are providing services and workforce for a wide variety of AI companies. I would like to share very briefly our approach and how it could help. Fair Work Project developed principles and thresholds with a series of labor standards, which have been used to score digital labor platforms, as Sonam said when she introduced me. They can also be implemented by any stakeholder to assess digital labor platforms' working conditions, not only by us. These principles reinforce and complement the PAI white paper's principles and recommendations. Fair Work's reports in a growing body of literature, and this is becoming very clear in different fields of knowledge, have been showing how digital labor platforms unfortunately promote precarious working relations and are far from ensuring basic labor standards. Our principles for AI list aspects which could amplify the positive outcomes for workers of the DeepMind effort to adopt changes, and not only DeepMind's, but other companies that are studying to adopt the tables and the guidelines inspired by this case study. The Fair Work AI principles address fairness not only in data enrichment projects, but taking a broad look at how AI is used in production networks and how it impacts society. This also includes the purpose of AI system and their consequence on different fields of society. And this is super important to understand that we are talking on one side about workers, but of course that we are talking on the other side also about workers and society as general. So to finish, I would like just to very quickly list our AI principles, and they are concerning to ensuring fair work, build fair production networks, promote explainability, strive for equity, make fair decisions, use data fairly, enhance safety, create future-proof jobs, avoid inappropriate deployment, and advance collective worker voice. I'm going to put in the chat the link to our report. So I was really quick, but please don't mind if you want to know a little more about our principles. I hope PAI's efforts, as well as other labor and ethic guidelines projects, can be increasingly considered and implemented by AI companies. This can promote fair practices in digital labor platforms. So once again, congrats to PAI and DeepMind for this effort. But as Jessica said, I think that we're really curious and excited to see the work ahead and the next steps. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Again, amazingly thoughtful remarks and a lot to think on. I think one of the first questions that you started with, Jonas, I think is a really a good one to kick off our sort of joint panel and conversation. How does DeepMind plan to incorporate external feedback and additional feedback? And I think that that's a conversation that I'd love to have not only with DeepMind, but like with the community at large, right? And I think part of our incentive to put this out there and to do this from PAI has been to start that dialogue, to start saying, okay, this is what, this is our first take, let's put this out there and see what happens. But we really want to incorporate, we want feedback and we want people to be engaging with this work. So very excited to have that conversation, but I'd love to get Will and Antonia, your thoughts on that.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. This is a really important question. And I think the way we've been thinking about this is on two levels. So external feedback from people who are working in organizations like yourselves, Jonas or Jessica, and then feedback from workers themselves and people on the ground being impacted by this type of work. Now, our efforts with PAI and through releasing the case study in the blog post are explicitly, our framing is that we want to understand what we're doing well and what we should be doing more of and what should be different, in the hope that we can, with the industry, create better standards. We don't think this is perfect. We don't think this is the end of the road. We want to be doing more. So we're hoping that this is exactly the type of venue and the type of place to hear feedback from yourselves. And so it's great to be having this conversation and hearing those thoughts. That was very, very, very helpful. Then obviously there's feedback from worker groups and workers themselves. We're hoping that we will hear feedback on our approach from people who are impacted by what we're doing, but also the people we're engaging with. We have communication mechanisms, and what we seek to do through those communication mechanisms is understand whether or not we're meeting the expectations and the needs of workers, and feedback can come back to us to iterate on our studies and change what we're doing. If we got feedback through those mechanisms that our practices and principles are not quite right, then that's a moment for us to reflect and work out what should we do next. But it's really important. I think something else that was said in there was it's really important that we can't set standards alone. And what we're hoping to do is, by doing this with PAI and by doing this with people like yourselves, and we're able to create new practices, new standards within the industry, and provide more avenues for workers and other groups to be engaging in these conversations.
Thank you. Yeah. And I'm curious. So Jessica, you mentioned how digital platforms might be levers of change. And I think that this is an interesting question for this group, because of course, like, this initiative is more focused on like what companies like AI, like DeepMind can do, people who are procuring the data. And Jonas has worked a lot with platforms and had a lot of conversations with platforms. So very curious to sort of hear everyone's kind of thoughts on what are things that are you perceive as things that companies can do versus things that, or AI companies can do versus things that platforms can do. So how do we target our efforts as we try to get broader adoption of fair work standards across the industry? What are sort of the appropriate conversations to have with different parties? And I asked this partly because, as you kind of alluded to, Jessica, there were things that we couldn't quite do on our own in this case study. Payment is one of those things where, if you want to set sort of even a living wage, right, based off of geographic location, some of the platforms don't have very good data on the exact geographic location. And that's a limitation that a company on its own can't maybe do. So that's also an opportunity for collective things potentially. But I'm curious to hear what might be effective lines of reasoning and what might be effective ways to start targeting those interventions. And I'd love to hear from both you and Jonas and everyone actually on this one.
I'd love to hear Jonas's take, because I think it's really in Fair Work's wheelhouse. But just a couple of notes from me. I think companies are well positioned to do what's being done here, right? Which is to like take a stab at it, to pilot some things and to identify where it actually is possible for companies to make some decisions, to put some processes into place that have an impact. And what are those things exactly, like you've just identified, Sonam, that we want to do this, but X, Y, and Z about the platform or the provider creates this limitation for us. So starting to surface and understand and actually being able to create a better data set of the individual versus the collaborative needs. I think the other thing to really keep in mind here is in what requires the collaborative effort is the competitive nature of all of this, right? What aspects are aspects of platforms because of digital platforms, either because there's not an ask or the influence to do it a different way yet, and or because it's a question of cost and competitiveness. And so, I mean, the trick about collaboration is to find the place where pre-competition works and or the level of critical mass of influence and partnership between AI orgs and platforms and workers, where changes can be made that actually are part of an ecosystem that is supporting each other. So I say that it's not probably a useful strategy to try to influence vendor platforms to change things about themselves without AI orgs being willing to partner in the expense, the journey, all of that kind of thing as well. So those are a couple of things that come to mind for me, but would love to hear others thinking on it.
Should I add some thoughts, Sonam?
Please.
No,
Yes.
I will bring what Will mentioned, what he said, that we should create an incentive system. And I think that this is an amazing idea. This is what we need to do. So we have to have an incentive system with different dimensions and level. In the higher level, we have regulations, we have and this is a discussion not only about AI, but about platform work all around the world and internationally. We're having this discussion, for instance, in ILO right now. But of course, like OECD and other international organizations are debating that. We have international artificial intelligence strategies and laws being discussed in a lot of parliaments. So you have this side of the ecosystem, you have the side of the guidelines. So PAI guidelines are super important. And I wanted to stress that I believe that the white papers has so much good stuff to explore, and the service provider questions are amazing. And I think that PAI guidelines, Fair Work guidelines, and other guidelines, of course, we are not only the two organizations doing that, but we have a set of guidelines that could be easily adopted by companies. And of course, that companies can discuss their guidelines or can adapt or some kind implement a part of our guidelines. Of course, that we defend that you implement the maximum possible guidelines, because we understand that here, unfortunately, we're not talking about the ideal world. We're not talking about perfect companies. Unfortunately, we're talking about super basic standards. We're talking about minimum wage. We're talking about people working for 10 or 8 hours. That is workers' demand from the 19th century. And now we have to discuss it again. We're talking about safety. We had a lot of platforms. And of course, that if we look at a location-based or a transportation or delivery platform, the risks are more clear. But also what our research is showing is that data enrichment workers and online freelance workers, they also face security and safety issues. So we have a lot of concerns about the situation that we have right now, and we have to foster this incentive system and mutual incentive system. So if we had a major company as DeepMind and other companies that start to drawing the red line and say, okay, we're not going to do, this is our minimum. At the same time, we have to pressure platforms to say, okay, we're not going to do a project that you want to do for this price because this is below the minimum wage. So we have to pressure both sides, and at the same time trying to bring this discussion to society. And that's why I think that workers' organizations, consumers' organizations, and academia. So we have a set of stakeholders, and if all those stakeholders work together, I think that we can build on a system that could be beneficial to workers and to companies. But as Jessica said, you will always have the competition pressure element. And the question is that you cannot use that to justify lower working conditions. And this is our main concern.
Will or Antonia, do you want to add to that or have a follow-up?
I think that the one thing that I would add is that our hope is that by creating this kind of framework or these guidelines, that we can use that as a kind of evaluative framework for when we look to kind of diversify the platforms that we use, or when other companies might think to diversify their platform structures. What are the questions we need to be asking when we're diligencing a platform that we might want to use? Like, can we make sure that when we're having these kind of contracting discussions, for example, that we can kind of lever it that way? It might not be the platform itself that is making the decisions, but it would be a kind of, if more companies were able to put those kind of levers in place, then it might be a kind of forcing function later on down the line.
So I'm cognizant of the time, and we have some audience questions as well. And I think this one kind of connects neatly to Jonas, something that you kind of mentioned as well. This is a question from Mary. If the panel can speak to who else or might benefit from the guidelines, procurement leads, policy analysts in the industry. And so when we're talking about sort of what are the external pressures and different incentives that might lead to companies sort of taking this on, also looking at how to target sort of who within these companies are empowered to make change, who can be actors. And I think one of the challenges in the area is that there's a fair amount of ambiguity on who actually has the power to change things. There's a lot of finger pointing, and I think both Jessica and Jonas, you guys have talked to a lot of different people across the ecosystem where, you know, some platforms will say, well, it's like the AI companies, and some AI companies will say it's the platforms. And then it's like, who within the AI companies, who within the platforms, and within organizations, there's a lot of diversity. Amongst organizations, there's a lot of diversity. And so for something like this, how would you imagine, you know, the right people to go to with something like this sort of guidelines, or, you know, some of the work that Fair Work has been doing to say, hey, like, take this up? What are sort of the right pressure points to apply?
Anyone or
anyone? Jessica, go for it.
I don't have the answer. I think the answer is that in the experience that I've had, it's quite varied, right? So to your point, the ownership for something like this can be kind of distributed across an organization, and probably it looks a little different depending on the organization. So, but I think that having the guidelines to be able to engage with the interested party, right, wherever you find them, whether it's in the human rights team or in the responsible sourcing team or in the procurement team, or in the product team, being able to have the guidelines as a starting point, I think is really critical. And then I guess one other thing I would add is just, perhaps they would be very helpful to also share with workers as just a sense of, this is what we're endeavoring towards, to the point of Jonas about gathering feedback, but also just awareness of what kind of the basic rights or intentions do look like, so that workers are also more positioned to advocate on behalf of themselves, even though that's very challenging in this environment.
Just following the same order, we've been trying, Fair Work tries to engage, of course, with platforms, because we present them our provisional scores and then give them time to adopt changes and to provide us with evidence. And we try to do this, it's the more participative possible. But of course, not all platforms are open for that. We have a lot of platforms that unfortunately tries to deny even the working relations on that. And this is super problematic, because they think that they simply do not acknowledge that they have working relations on that. So I think that we have platforms that are moving, and our league tables, our scoring, they show that. We have platforms that in a scale from 0 to 10, they get a 9, they get an 8 or a 7. And we have a lot of platforms, including big platforms in our cloud work, for example, Amazon Mechanical Turk, Upwork, and others that had a 0 score. So I think that we're still, unfortunately, very far, and I believe that everyone can play a part here. I think that platforms need to play a part, AI companies, and when we're talking about AI, and that's why AI Fair Work principles, they are much more complex and broader than normal Fair Work principles, because we're talking about a super complex ecosystem, and we're talking about chains of production and companies like DeepMind and others that are hiring different service providers, and at the same time they're developing service for different hires. And I think that this kind of apparently fragmentation, because on the other half we have concentration of ownership on some conglomerates, but we cannot let this apparent fragmentation justify to see, okay, so we don't know how to move forward, but we have commercial associations, we have consumers associations, and I believe that in the international level, something that we need to do is to try to build more institutional dialogue spaces. When we look, for example, at the internet, you have a very consolidated history of internet governance. So, and internet is a very complex field, much broader than only platform work. So I believe that this can be done, but of course that we need to make things more closer and foster more debates. And I think that this case study is one initiative that shows how we can move for that in this direction. But I believe that we are very far from where we should be right now.
Yeah. I'll answer another, or I'll pose another audience question, but I wanted to pause to see if Will and Antonia, you have any questions for Jessica and Jonas, or vice versa.
I guess the key question on my side, and I think we're talking about it through this conversation, is where we should go next and who we should be next engaging with. Now, of course, there is this big question of how do we engage with platforms that we're working with and what's the right way to do that. And then there is how do we work with our peers in industry. Now, one of the challenges for us is that we're coming at this mostly from a research angle, and that means that the culture of our organization is different. The institutions of our organization is different. People are already very familiar with IRBs and that need in that process. It's probably different in other organizations, probably very different. And so what we're trying to work out is how do we best collaborate with other similar organizations to do this type of thing? How do we best get feedback? How do we best work with other groups like yourselves or platforms and others to push this further? I think that would be what I would love to hear most.
I mean, I think it's a really, really important question. I think, what I would love to see actually is maybe follow up within, 6 months or a year. Like, what have you learned from instituting these processes over that period of time? And what has surfaced as the elements that you see most urgent need around collaborating with other organizations for? So I think Jonas spoke to, and I'll let maybe Jonas speak to more how to engage with workers directly, or certain organizations directly that that can inform some of those areas and that feedback. But I would suggest a really good next step would be identifying the areas that you see the most urgent need for collaboration, and then actually, come back to BSR, because we've been trying to figure that out, where the appetite for collaborative action, because we see such a great need for it, but where the appetite is for it. So, we're an organization that hosts and tries to create connections for companies where action sometimes feels a little intractable. So we'd be happy to have that conversation. But I think the work that you're doing to identify what those areas are and where the urgency is really, really critical to identifying what the next step for engagement is.
Thanks. I believe that you can engage with you can move in different directions. I believe that the first direction would be maybe to take, as I said in my first comment, take a more detailed look at the PAI white paper, because I think that there are a lot of good guidelines and recommendations there. Unfortunately, all of us need to summarize that in something that more people are going to read. So this happens to all of us. And I know that Sonam must have suffered, because she needed to condense and to summarize all those recommendations in 5 guidelines. But I believe that the white paper has a lot of other guidelines and recommendations and important observations on that. So only this would be a very important step. Of course, that fair work is one of others, and a lot of places where you can take labor standards and see, okay, you can do a mix of different projects. I believe that the only thing is that you can move forward with the labor standards to choose the service providers. I think this would be super, super, super relevant, because this is when, as you said, you make an incentive. And when you reported what happened to the AI community with the journals and the conferences, when they started to demand and to impose conditions to see, okay, we need to consider the ethics of AI, I think that we should do the same we need to consider the working conditions, not only from AI, but platform work and stuff like that. So I believe that you can engage with projects and initiatives as ours, but with others, engage with your peers to see what these peers can do. And I think that PAI is one space to do that. And we always recommend that in Fair Work, that is engage with your workers and engage with workers associations. So maybe this could be one next step, not the only one, but one next step to take a look and see, okay, so how workers' organizations see the consequences of our conditions and our guidelines to workers that are in data enrichment platform. So I believe that you have a lot of pathways to follow, and of course that you cannot do all at the same time, but I think that, and of course that we are available to discuss this in more detail if you want.
Yeah.
If I could add one more note to that, Sonam, I'm sorry. It's just actually spurred by a comment in the chat, which is that a lot of industries and a lot of supply chains have gone through this process from, labor risks and challenges and concerns to individual action, to trying to collaborate, et cetera, towards a standardized approach to responsible sourcing. I will say, I think that I don't know if anyone's figured it out fully, but there's a lot to learn from other industries that have been working on this. Obviously, the nature of the ecosystem is very unique and very different, and that has to be taken into account. But there is some opportunity to leapfrog the learnings of other industries on responsible sourcing here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jessica. And I was hoping to get to that question. We didn't get to all of the audience questions, and so we'll follow up with those who posted them. We have them, and I'll circulate them to our speakers and get back to you. I do want to say we are actively looking for feedback. So Josh just put a link to the feedback form in the chat, and we want to be engaging with people. So this is the first of many conversations, hopefully. And if you have feedback on what we've done and what the guidelines are, what the resources are, the case study, anything, please fill it out, or you can contact me directly. My contact is on our website, and I'm really looking forward to continuing to build on this work and work together. And thank you so much to Will, Antonia, Jonas, and Jessica for a fantastic conversation, and hopefully first of many for this group.